Life doesn't always turn out the way we plan. Sometimes, the dreams we chased in our youth crumble, leaving us with nothing but the sharp sting of regret and a stack of bills we can't quite pay off. That's exactly where David Martin found himself, once brimming with ambition, now a college dropout struggling to make ends meet. David Martin was the kind of guy whose life looked like a series of wrong turns. In his mid-20s, he found himself standing at the entrance of Brookside Senior Living, clutching a toolbox that seemed to weigh as heavily as his regrets. Dropping out of college had once felt like a rebellion, a statement of freedom, but now it was just a reminder of missed opportunities. His friends had moved on, some working in high-rise offices, others flaunting new cars and spacious apartments, while he shuffled from one dead-end job to another. The temporary handyman position wasn't even something he chose. It was desperation that drove him there, a need to pay rent and keep his small studio apartment. As he stepped inside for the first time, the scent of old wood and faded wallpaper mixed with the faint aroma of coffee brewing somewhere down the hall. The atmosphere felt heavy, almost somber. David's goal was straightforward: get in, fix whatever was broken, and get out. No drama, no lingering, and definitely no personal connections. But fate had other plans. On his first day, he bumped into Mr. Wilson, a World War II veteran who moved with the slow grace of a man who'd seen more than his share of suffering. "Lost, are you?" the old man asked with a raised eyebrow, leaning on his cane. David mumbled something about looking for the boiler room. With a wry smile, Mr. Wilson pointed him in the right direction, adding, "It's not the only thing you'll need to fix around here." It was just a throwaway comment, but something in the veteran's gaze struck a chord. As David continued with his work, the other residents, once just faceless names on a job sheet, began to reveal bits and pieces of their own stories. Mrs. Delaney, the retired schoolteacher, would shuffle over to his workspace every time he worked on the garden shed, offering unsolicited gardening advice and telling tales of students who had gone on to change the world. She had a way of speaking that was both stern and warm, making David feel oddly like he was back in grade school, receiving a stern reminder to mind his manners. Yet it was Mr. Thompson, a soft-spoken retired engineer, who left the deepest impression. Their paths crossed in the early evenings when most of the facility quieted down, the residents either resting or lost in their own thoughts. Mr. Thompson had gnarled hands from years of hard work, the kind that told of a lifetime spent solving problems, building bridges, and fixing what was broken. David would often find him sitting by the back porch, staring out into the small, overgrown garden. "Funny thing about bridges," Mr. Thompson mused one evening, as David tightened a loose porch railing. "You spend your whole life building them, connecting places, people, but some gaps you can't bridge alone." There was a wistfulness in his voice, a sadness that seemed out of place against the peaceful twilight. David didn't know what to say, so he just nodded and kept working, his own thoughts whirling. Day by day, David's initial plan to just keep his head down unraveled. The residents, many with fading memories and tired smiles, drew him in with snippets of their lives. They had seen wealth and poverty, triumphs and downfalls, and yet here they were in a place where even their stories seemed to be gathering dust. He found himself lingering after work, listening as Mrs. Jenkins, a petite woman with a sharp mind and a tragic past, recounted how she'd once run a small business, only to watch it crumble during a market crash. "It's like losing a part of yourself," she'd say quietly, her eyes distant. "One minute, you're on top, with money, cars and a house. Then poof, it's all gone." Her words struck a nerve. David had never known real wealth, but he understood what it felt like to watch dreams slip through your fingers. The more time David spent at Brookside, the less it felt like just another job. These people, with their wrinkled faces and trembling hands, had become more than just residents. They were storytellers, mentors, and in some strange way, friends. He started showing up early, grabbing a cup of coffee from the break room, and wandering the hallways before his shift officially started. Sometimes he'd find Mrs. Delaney in the garden, inspecting the flowers with the same intensity she'd probably once used to inspect students' homework. Other times it was Mr. Wilson, tapping his cane against the porch railing, waiting for David to pass by so he could share a few sarcastic remarks and occasionally a nugget of wisdom. One rainy afternoon, as David patched up a leaky roof, He overheard Mrs. Jenkins talking to one of the nurses. "That boy's got a good heart," she said softly. "But hearts like that, they get tired. They need something more to hold on to." The words echoed in David's mind for days. He had come to Brookside expecting nothing, but now he was tangled up in these lives, feeling a strange mixture of hope and sadness every time he clocked out. Was he just passing through, or was there something more here for him? It wasn't just a story of fixing broken pipes and creaky floorboards anymore. The residents, each with their own struggles and comebacks, were showing him that maybe, just maybe, he still had a chance to rebuild the bridges he'd burned along the way. As the weeks turned into months, David's role at Brookside began to evolve. He was still the handyman, still the guy with the toolbox and the grease-stained shirt, but he was also becoming a confidant, a listener. Residents who rarely spoke to anyone else started seeking him out, not just for help fixing things, but for the chance to talk. Mr. Thompson would regale him with stories of engineering marvels, of bridges that stood against the elements, much like the human spirit. "A bridge's strength," he'd say, voice low and thoughtful, "isn't in its design. It's in the connections it makes, the weight it carries." The metaphors weren't lost on David. Every conversation seemed to add another layer to his own fragmented life, giving him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Despite the burgeoning connections, David kept a wary distance. He knew better than to get attached. After all, he was just the handyman. The job could end any day. And then what? He'd be back to square one, drifting, searching for meaning. But every time he tried to detach himself, one of the residents would pull him back in with a story or a request that seemed too small to matter, and yet, somehow, mattered more than anything else. Like the time Mr. Wilson asked him to fix an old music box that hadn't worked in years. David spent hours on it, tinkering long after his shift ended. When it finally played a soft, lilting tune, the old man's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Haven't heard that song since 42, he whispered. It was moments like that, the unexpected glimpses into their worlds, that kept David coming back. But just as David started to feel like he belonged, rumors began to swirl, talks of budget cuts, whispers of layoffs. Suddenly his future at Brookside seemed as fragile as the residents themselves. Would he be the next to go? What would happen to these people if he wasn't around to fix the little things that made their days a bit brighter? The uncertainty gnawed at him, a constant reminder that his story, just like the residents', was still unwritten. David's presence at Brookside Senior Living had become a steady rhythm in the residents' lives. He wasn't just the guy who fixed broken light fixtures or patched up leaky pipes anymore. He was David, the one who stopped to listen, who took his time, who made people feel seen. Gradually, his morning routine shifted. Instead of clocking in and diving straight into his to-do list, he'd start his day with a slow walk through the halls, greeting the residents by name, exchanging a few jokes with Mr. Wilson, or sneaking a cup of coffee from the break room to share with Mrs. Delaney in the garden. What began as small talk turned into something deeper. He'd sit with Mr. Thompson watching the sunset, listening to tales of a world long gone, stories of building bridges that connected not just places but people during times when hope seemed scarce. "There's always something to build," Mr. Thompson would say, his voice soft but steady, even when it feels like everything's falling apart. It wasn't long before David's role expanded beyond what his job description dictated. When Mrs. Jenkins broke her favorite teapot, a relic from her childhood, she didn't call for a nurse or the facility's maintenance team. She called David. "Just a silly old thing," she murmured, handing it over with trembling hands. But David could see the hope in her eyes. He spent the better part of an evening piecing it back together, meticulously gluing each delicate shard until the teapot was whole again. When he returned it, the look of pure joy on her face was worth more than any paycheck. "I haven't had tea from this in years," she whispered, cradling it like a long-lost friend. From that day on, residents began to approach him not just for repairs, but for help with mementos, small keepsakes that held decades of stories and emotions. As David became more embedded in the fabric of the facility, his relationships with the residents deepened. Mr. Wilson shared more than just war stories. He opened up about the loneliness that gnawed at him in the quiet hours of the night. "All my comrades are gone," he admitted one evening, eyes misty. "Feels like I'm the only one left. still fighting battles no one else can see. David didn't know what to say, but he sat beside the old soldier, sharing the silence, feeling the weight of time and memory settle around them. He realized then that fixing things wasn't just about hammers and nails. Sometimes it was about being there, showing up, listening, giving people a reason to believe they weren't alone. But just as David's sense of belonging grew, a dark cloud began to loom over Brookside. Rumors of budget cuts swept through the facility, sparking a quiet panic. It started with whispers in the hallways, hushed conversations between staff members, and nervous glances from the residents. Then came the official announcement. Due to financial constraints, several positions would be eliminated. David's heart sank. He'd been through this before, jobs that disappeared overnight, leaving him scrambling to piece together a living. But this time was different. This time he wasn't just losing a job, he was losing a community, people who'd become like family. The news hit the residents hard too. Mr. Thompson clenched his jaw, his usually calm demeanor fracturing. "What will happen to us if they keep cutting back?" he muttered. "Who's going to care when the lights go out? When the roof starts leaking?" David tried to keep his composure, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. Each morning he'd walk through Brookside, wondering if it would be his last day. Should he start looking for another job? Move on like he always had? But every time he thought about leaving, a new request would come in. A leaky faucet that needed fixing, a loose railing that had become a safety hazard. And behind each task was a face, a story, a person who'd come to depend on him. He felt trapped, torn between practicality and purpose. Mrs. Jenkins sensed his unease. One afternoon, as he mended a broken picture frame in her room, she looked at him with startling clarity. "You can't just leave, you know," she said quietly. "You've built something here. You matter to us." The words haunted him. He'd spent years drifting, chasing the next paycheck, the next fleeting opportunity. And now, for the first time, he felt like he had something worth staying for. But what could he do? He was just a handyman, a college dropout with no money, no power. The budget cuts rolled on. First, the part-time nurse was let go, then the facility's activities coordinator. Each loss was like a tiny death, a reminder that things were unraveling. And then one grey morning, the director called David into his office. The look on the man's face said it all. "David, I'm sorry," he began. "We have to let you go." David sat there, numb, staring at the desk as the director outlined severance pay and final work dates. It felt surreal, like watching a scene from someone else's life. The director's voice faded into the background, replaced by a rushing in his ears, a storm of thoughts and emotions. Leaving meant severing the connections he'd painstakingly built. It meant abandoning the residents, Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Jenkins, Mr. Wilson, and all the others who'd come to trust him, rely on him. But what choice did he have? He couldn't fight budget cuts. He couldn't change the numbers on a spreadsheet. He was just David, the handyman. When he stepped out of the office, the residents were waiting. Word traveled fast at Brookside. They gathered around him, Mr. Thompson leaning heavily on his cane, Mrs. Delaney clutching her gardening gloves, Mr. Wilson with a grim set to his mouth. "So, it's true then?" Mrs. Jenkins asked softly. David nodded, throat tight. A heavy silence fell over the group, and then, to his shock, Mr. Thompson stepped forward, eyes fierce. "We're not letting you go that easily," the old engineer growled. "We'll fight this." It started small, a few phone calls, letters to the facilities board. But as the days passed, the residents rallied behind David in ways he never expected. Mr. Wilson gathered signatures while Mrs. Delaney penned heartfelt notes to the administration, recounting how David had gone above and beyond to make Brookside feel like a home again. Even Mrs. Jenkins, who rarely left her room, made a trip to the office, her small frame trembling with emotion as she pleaded David's case. "He's not just a worker," she insisted. "He's one of us." The board didn't budge, but something had shifted. The residents, people who had once seemed resigned to their circumstances, were standing up, speaking out, and in the middle of it all was David, overwhelmed by their support. He hadn't realized how much he meant to them, how much they meant to him. Maybe he couldn't save his job, but he wasn't going to walk away without a fight. He started showing up on his days off, fixing things for free, refusing to let the place fall apart just because the budget couldn't stretch. The residents noticed. They started pooling together their savings. A few dollars here, a few there, to keep him on. It wasn't much, but it was everything. A testament to the bonds they'd forged, to the community they'd built together. It wasn't enough to keep him employed, but it was more than he'd ever had. The residents weren't just trying to save his job. They were trying to save the heart of Brookside, the sense of hope and connection he'd brought back into their lives. And that realization struck David harder than any pink slip ever could. David spent his last official day at Brookside Senior Living with a strange mixture of sadness and determination. He moved through the facility like a ghost, fixing anything that could break, patching up every crack and creak he could find. The residents watched in silence, their faces etched with worry. But it wasn't until he ran into Mrs. Jenkins in the hallway that everything changed. She was sitting by the large bay window, the one that overlooked the small garden he'd helped her plant last summer. Normally reserved and soft-spoken, Mrs. Jenkins looked different today, stronger somehow. When David paused to check on her, she turned those sharp eyes on him and patted the seat beside her. "Sit with me a moment, won't you?" David hesitated, but eventually set down his toolbox and lowered himself onto the bench. For a moment, they sat in silence, watching the world outside the glass. "I've seen a lot of people come and go in my time here," Mrs. Jenkins began softly, "and most of them, well, they don't make much of an impression." She glanced at him, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "But you've been different, David. You made us believe that we still matter." He swallowed hard, not trusting himself to speak. What was there to say? He was leaving. He'd failed. But before he could voice any of those thoughts, Mrs. Jenkins reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out an old photograph, a faded picture of a young woman in a white coat. "I wanted to be a doctor once," she murmured. "Had the grades, the drive, the ambition, but then my parents died, and someone had to look after my younger siblings." David blinked, caught off guard. Mrs. Jenkins, a doctor? It seemed impossible. She'd always been so quiet, so unassuming. But as she spoke, her voice steady and calm, David could see it. The passion, the fire that must have burned so brightly in her younger years. "Life doesn't always go the way we plan," she continued, gaze distant. "But that doesn't mean we're failures. Sometimes the paths we take, the ones we never meant to, are the ones that make the biggest difference." She turned to him then, eyes bright. "You didn't plan on being here, David, but you're here now, and you've done more for us than you'll ever know." The words hit David like a punch to the gut. He'd spent so long believing he was just drifting, just filling in the gaps where he could. But Mrs. Jenkins was right. Somehow, without even realizing it, he'd become more than just a handyman. He'd become a lifeline. And now, as he looked around at the faces of the people who'd come to mean so much to him, he knew he couldn't just walk away. Maybe he couldn't save his job, but he could still make a difference. "What if I stayed?" he blurted out before he could stop himself. Mrs. Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "You mean stay here? Without getting paid?" David nodded slowly, heart pounding. It was a crazy idea, reckless, but something inside him had shifted. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about doing something that mattered. "I can still help," he insisted, "even if it's just for a little while. I'll find another job eventually, but for now, I want to finish what I started." The residents were stunned. They'd fought so hard to keep him, pooling together their meager savings, writing letters, making phone calls, and now here he was, willing to stay without pay. "You're serious?" Mr. Thompson asked, his voice gruff with emotion. David nodded. "Yeah, I am." A murmur spread through the group, surprise, disbelief, and something else. Hope. "Well, I'll be damned," Mr. Wilson muttered, shaking his head. "You're a stubborn fool, kid, but if anyone can pull this off, it's you." With a renewed sense of purpose, David threw himself into his work. He spent every spare moment at Brookside, patching up what he could, fixing what others had given up on. The residents, inspired by his determination, rallied around him. They started taking on small tasks themselves, cleaning up the garden, repainting the fences, even organizing small fundraisers. "We're not just sitting around, you know," Mrs. Delaney quipped one afternoon as she scrubbed down a rusty old bench. "If you're staying, we're pitching in." The momentum built slowly, each small act of defiance, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, there was always hope. But then, one afternoon, David found Mr. Thompson in the back garden, staring out at the trees with a strange, far-away look in his eyes. "You're pushing yourself too hard," the old man murmured, not looking at him. I've seen it before. Men who think they can carry the weight of the world on their shoulders. It never ends well. David frowned, confused. I'm just trying to help, he said quietly. Mr. Thompson turned then, his gaze sharp. There's a difference between helping and burning yourself out, son. You can't do this alone. The words stayed with David long after he'd left the garden. Mr. Thompson was right. No matter how hard he worked, how many hours he put in, he couldn't save Brookside by himself. And yet, as he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of his cramped apartment, a new idea began to take shape. He didn't have money, he didn't have power, but he had something else, a community. The residents weren't just people he helped. They were allies, partners in a fight that was bigger than any of them. Maybe, just maybe, they could build something together. The next morning, David called a meeting in the common room. The residents shuffled in, curious but wary. I have an idea, he began, voice steady. It's a long shot, but what if we started a non-profit? Silence. Then Mr. Wilson let out a bark of laughter. You're kidding, right? You think we can pull off something like that? David's heart raced. Why not? He countered. We've already done so much together. What if we took it further? We could provide home repair services for elderly residents. People like you, who can't afford to pay for big repairs but still need help. The room buzzed with murmurs. We can call it Bridges of Hope, he continued, glancing at Mr. Thompson, who stared back, eyes wide. Because that's what this is about. Building bridges, connecting people who need help with those who can give it. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, Mrs. Jenkins stood up. I think it's a wonderful idea, she said quietly, and I want to help. One by one, the residents nodded. Mr. Wilson grumbled something about crazy kids, but there was a twinkle in his eye. Well, hell, he muttered. Count me in, too. David's heart soared. This was it. The turning point. The beginning of something bigger than himself. Something that could outlast any budget cut, any setback. They worked late into the night, sketching out plans, brainstorming ideas. The energy in the room was electric, a blend of excitement and fear and hope. For the first time in his life, David felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The residents weren't just clients. They were partners, friends, a community united by a shared dream. And as they put pen to paper, laying the groundwork for Bridges of Hope, David knew that no matter what happened next, they would face it together. David threw himself into building Bridges of Hope with the same tenacity he'd once used to tackle stubborn leaks and broken fixtures. Only this time, the stakes were much higher. There were no blueprints to follow. No manual that outlined how to turn an idea into a reality. Every day brought a new challenge, a legal form he didn't understand, a call from a potential donor that went nowhere, or a volunteer who didn't show up. But for every setback, there was a small victory. A local hardware store agreed to donate supplies. An old friend offered to help set up a basic website. And the residents, Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Delaney, Mrs. Jenkins, and even Mr. Wilson, continued to be his greatest champions, spreading the word and offering encouragement whenever his resolve wavered. Still, the pressure mounted. David found himself working around the clock, juggling part-time jobs to keep a roof over his head while spending every free moment pushing Bridges of Hope forward. There were nights when he'd collapse onto his bed, too exhausted to sleep, wondering if he'd made a mistake. What if this all fell apart? What if he failed? Again, those thoughts gnawed at him, threatening to undo everything. But then he'd remember Mrs. Jenkins' quiet strength, Mr. Thompson's unwavering belief in him, and he'd get back up, more determined than ever. One cold evening, as David sat alone in his tiny apartment poring over funding applications, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Mr. Thompson. "We miss you around here," it read. Simple words, but they brought a lump to David's throat. He hadn't been able to visit Brookside as much lately, too caught up in the whirlwind of starting a non-profit. The guilt weighed heavy on him, but there was no way around it. If Bridges of Hope was going to survive, he needed to be all in. Still, he decided to stop by the next day, just for a quick visit. When he arrived, the residents greeted him with smiles and hugs, their faces lighting up at the sight of him. It was like coming home. But it wasn't all good news. "Mr. Thompson's been having a rough time," Mrs. Jenkins confided quietly, as they sat by the garden. "He won't say anything, but we're worried." The old engineer's health had been declining for months, but he'd always brushed it off, insisting he was fine. Seeing him now slumped in his chair, eyes dull, David felt a pang of fear. "Hey, Mr. Thompson," he called softly, crouching beside him. The older man glanced up, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "Well, if it isn't the handyman turned world changer," he rasped. "How's the empire building going?" David laughed, but it sounded hollow. "Could be better," he admitted. "Could be a lot worse." Mr. Thompson nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on his face. "That's life for you," he murmured, "full of ups and downs, but you're doing something real, son, something that'll last." He paused, eyes distant. "I just wish I could be there to see it." David's heart clenched. "What do you mean? You're going to be right there with us. You're part of this, remember?" But Mr. Thompson just smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Some bridges, they don't get finished in our lifetime, but that doesn't mean they're not worth building." The next few weeks were a blur. Between pushing Bridges of Hope forward and trying to spend as much time as possible with the residents, David felt stretched thin. Mr. Thompson's health continued to decline, and every visit felt like borrowed time. But the old man's spirit never wavered. Even when he was too weak to speak, he'd tap out messages to David on his notepad, offering advice, encouragement, and, most of all, belief. "Don't give up," one note read in shaky handwriting, "even when it seems impossible." Then, one crisp morning, David received a call that shattered him. Mr. Thompson had passed away in his sleep. The news hit him like a punch to the gut. He knew it was coming. Everyone had known, but that didn't make it any easier. It felt like losing a part of himself, like one of the pillars holding him up had crumbled. He drove to Brookside in a daze, heart heavy, memories of their conversations swirling in his mind. The residents were devastated. Mrs. Jenkins wept quietly. Mr. Wilson stood stoic, but pale, and Mrs. Delaney clutched her gardening gloves, staring blankly at the ground. They gathered in the small garden behind the facility, where Mr. Thompson had spent so many evenings with David, talking about life, loss, and the bridges we build for others. As they stood there, David realized something. Mr. Thompson wasn't gone, not really. His words, his belief in Bridges of Hope, lived on, and now, more than ever, David was determined to see it through. "This is for you, Mr. Thompson," he whispered under his breath. Head bowed. "I won't let you down." With renewed focus, David threw himself into Bridges of Hope like never before. The residents, still reeling from their loss, rallied around him. They volunteered, organized fundraisers, even reached out to local businesses. It was as if Mr. Thompson's passing had lit a fire under them all, a determination to carry on his legacy. And slowly, inch by inch, Bridges of Hope began to take shape. Word spread. A local news station picked up the story, and soon donations started trickling in. Volunteers from all over the city reached out, offering their skills and time. But just as things started to look up, another obstacle loomed. The facility's new management wasn't happy about the attention Bridges of Hope was drawing. They saw it as a distraction, a liability. "We need to focus on running a business, not playing charity," the new director snapped during a tense meeting. "If you can't keep your little project separate from our operations, you'll have to take it elsewhere." David stared at the man, disbelief warring with anger. "This isn't a little project," he said quietly. "It's about helping people who need us." The director shrugged. "Be that as it may, it's not our concern." David left the office feeling defeated. All the progress they'd made, all the hope they'd built, was it really going to end like this? But then he thought of Mr. Thompson, of his unwavering belief that some bridges were worth building, no matter the cost. No, he couldn't give up. Not now. He gathered the residents together and explained the situation. Their response was immediate and unanimous. "We're not backing down," Mrs. Jenkins declared, eyes blazing. "If they want to push us out, let them. We'll build our own space, find our own way." And so they did. With the help of a few generous donors, they rented a small office downtown, a cramped, run-down space, but it was theirs, the first headquarters of Bridges of Hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. David looked around at the peeling paint, the flickering lights, and smiled. They'd come so far, against all odds, and with the residents by his side, he knew they'd go even further. The new office for Bridges of Hope was far from glamorous. It was a cramped second-floor unit in a rundown building downtown. With squeaky floors and faded wallpaper, that had seen better days. But to David and the residents it felt like a palace, a symbol of everything they'd fought for, and a promise of what was yet to come. They spent the first few weeks cleaning, painting, and setting up makeshift desks out of old folding tables. There was no fancy equipment, no state-of-the-art facilities, just a group of determined people and a vision they refused to give up on. David's heart swelled with pride every time he looked around and saw Mr. Wilson hammering nails into the wall, Mrs. Delaney meticulously organizing paperwork, or Mrs. Jenkins chatting animatedly on the phone with potential donors. They were building something real, something that would last, and it was all because of them, because they'd believed in a dream when no one else would. Despite the progress, the challenges were far from over. Setting up a non-profit from scratch was a daunting task, and David often found himself awake at odd hours, staring at spreadsheets that made his head spin. But every time he felt overwhelmed, a new surge of support would come in. A local cafe offering to host a fundraiser, a carpenter volunteering his time to build shelves for their tiny office, or an anonymous donation that arrived just when they needed it most. The city was beginning to take notice. Bridges of Hope wasn't just an idea anymore. It was becoming a movement. And with every new supporter, every new volunteer, David felt Mr. Thompson's presence beside him, a silent reminder to keep pushing forward. The turning point came one chilly morning when David received an unexpected call from Riley, a journalist who had been following their story. "We want to do a feature on Bridges of Hope," she announced, excitement crackling through the phone. David nearly dropped his coffee. "A feature on them? I don't know what to say," he stammered. "Say yes," Riley replied with a laugh. "This is the kind of story people need to hear." The article came out a week later, a beautifully written piece that captured not just the struggles they'd faced, but the heart and soul of what Bridges of Hope was all about. It told the story of the residents, Mrs. Jenkins, Mr. Wilson, Mrs. Delaney, and most poignantly, Mr. Thompson, their hardships, their resilience, and their unwavering belief in building something meaningful. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in from all over the country, small amounts from people who could barely spare it, and large sums from those who were moved by the story. Volunteers signed up in droves, offering their time, their skills, their energy. Within a month, they'd raised enough money to expand their services. David stood in the tiny office one evening, surrounded by boxes of supplies and stacks of letters from people wanting to help, and felt his throat tighten. They'd done it. Against all odds, they'd built something that mattered, and it was just the beginning. With the influx of resources, Bridges of Hope began to grow. They set up satellite teams in neighboring towns, recruited skilled workers to tackle bigger projects, and even partnered with local businesses to provide discounted services for elderly residents. David found himself busier than ever, juggling roles he'd never imagined: project manager, fundraiser, spokesperson. But every time he felt like he was drowning, the residents would step in, offering support and encouragement. Mr. Wilson became their unofficial morale officer, making sure everyone stayed motivated. Mrs. Jenkins handled community outreach, calling up everyone she knew and some people she didn't. Mrs. Delaney took charge of the volunteer schedules, running the show with the same no-nonsense efficiency she'd once used in her classroom. And then one sunny afternoon, David received a letter that left him speechless. It was from the family of Mr. Thompson. They'd heard about Bridges of Hope and wanted to help keep his legacy alive. Enclosed was a check, a donation large enough to secure the non-profit's future for years to come. David stared at the letter, tears pricking his eyes. Mr. Thompson had always believed in him, even when he doubted himself. Now, his family was passing that belief forward, ensuring that the bridges they'd built together would stand the test of time. The first major project they undertook was a complete renovation of Brookside Senior Living. The facility had fallen into disrepair after the budget cuts, and many of the residents were struggling. David rallied the volunteers, gathered the resources, and in a whirlwind of activity they transformed the place. New paint, new fixtures, a repaired roof, everything was redone. And when the last nail was hammered in, the residents gathered outside, tears of joy shining in their eyes. "This place, it's beautiful," Mrs. Jenkins whispered, voice trembling. "Just like it used to be." Word spread quickly. What had started as a small makeshift operation was now a full-fledged organization, impacting lives far beyond the walls of Brookside. They began receiving requests from across the state, from elderly residents who needed help but didn't know where to turn. Bridges of Hope expanded its reach, sending out teams to provide repairs, build ramps, install safety rails, whatever was needed to keep people safe and independent in their homes. And every time David stepped into a new house, met a new resident, he felt the same sense of purpose, the same drive that had fueled him from the beginning. But it wasn't just about fixing homes. It was about building connections. For every door they repaired, every light they replaced, there were stories shared, laughs exchanged, and friendships formed. Bridges of Hope became more than just a service. It was a community, a lifeline for those who'd been forgotten, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was always hope. Years passed. Bridges of Hope grew and evolved, but its mission remained the same: to build bridges between people, to connect those in need with those who could help. David, now in his early 30s, stood at the helm of an organization that had changed countless lives. He returned to Brookside often, not as an employee, but as a friend. The residents welcomed him with open arms, their faces lighting up at the sight of him. "You did it," Mrs. Delaney said one afternoon, tears in her eyes. "You really did it." David smiled, looking around at the place that had started it all. The garden, blooming brightly under the summer sun, the hallways, filled with laughter and conversation, and the people, Mrs. Jenkins, Mr. Wilson, Mrs. Delaney, who had become like family. They'd given him more than just a job. They'd given him a purpose, a reason to keep going. And as he stood there, surrounded by the community they'd built together, David understood what Mr. Thompson had meant all those years ago. Some bridges take time to build. Some are finished by others long after we're gone. But every brick, every beam, every small act of kindness, it all matters. It all adds up. And sometimes the people we think need us the most end up giving us exactly what we needed all along. Have you ever found yourself feeling lost, wondering if you're stuck in a job that's leading nowhere? What if the path you're on right now is exactly where you're meant to be? Imagine discovering that every setback, every dead end was preparing you for something far greater. What would you do if you found purpose in the last place you expected? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt like giving up, only to find hope in the most unlikely places? Share your stories. I'd love to hear how life surprised you when you least expected it. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. There's so much more to explore, and I'd love to have you join this journey of unexpected comebacks and heartwarming transformations.